Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, thank you for joining us again.
Very good to be with you as always, Nasim. Thank you for having me.
So this week we'll begin with a look at Israel's deadly attack on Nuseirat refugee camp, where more than 274 Palestinians have been brutally killed. Related to that, speculation that Israeli soldiers entered Gaza through the US aid pier disguised as aid workers. Speculations at the moment, but we'll have a look at that. Israel's inclusion to the UN list of states violating children's rights. That's another list no one wants to be part of, but Israel's been added to that list. Further revelation by the New York Times last week about torture and sexual abuse of Palestinians in a detention center. That's an ongoing story. We'll take a look at that as well. And the US Congress, the House of Representatives voting to sanction the ICC. I'll get Moin's thoughts on that as well. And the resignation of Benny Gantz, cabinet minister, criticizing Netanyahu from preventing what he calls a true victory, whatever that means. And we'll have a look at the hate march or flag march in Jerusalem and what that reflects about Israeli society in general and other issues as well. But let's begin, Moin, with the deadly attack on Nuseirat refugee camp over the weekend. More than 274 Palestinians have been killed. Scores of others have been injured. I'd like to get your view on that attack, especially on the fact that the Israeli military has rescued so far only 7 hostages and probably killed dozens of others in its operations, and also focusing on the fact that more hostages have been rescued or released through a peace negotiation. And there is also a proposal to have all the hostages free if Israel accepted the peace negotiations that have been agreed to by Hamas. Is this really about hostages?
I don't think it's primarily about hostages. Obviously, Israel was not going to pass up any opportunity to rescue captives by force. But at the same time, I think this was primarily about scoring a significant achievement on the battlefield, if you will. And to be sure, Israel's ability to conduct this raid and to retrieve 4 of its captives alive is an achievement, arguably a significant achievement, but it doesn't change the course of the war. It doesn't change the strategic equation. And certainly it doesn't change the main point, which you just mentioned, which is that Israel has had the opportunity to secure the release of all its captives and hostages since October in the context of a negotiated agreement, but it has consistently rejected such an agreement in favor of pursuing and intensifying its genocidal military onslaught on the Gaza Strip. And the one time that it did enter into negotiations, it released something like 20 times as many captives and hostages, I believe 120 or so, in late November. So that's by way of background. In terms of the details of this operation, of course, many of the details are a little opaque and require further confirmation. But it does appear that there are credible reports that not only did US and British intelligence cooperate intensively in the planning of this raid, some reports have suggested even the execution, but those for now are unverified reports. But there are also credible reports that this pier, whose main purpose has always been to divert attention from the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip and to kind of serve as cover for Israel's medieval siege of the Gaza Strip, that this pier played an important role in the execution of this raid, both in terms of infiltrating Israeli forces into Nuseirat refugee camp and in terms of the extraction of that force and the captives they had rescued. Now, what appears to have happened is something similar to two incidents we saw during Operation Protective Edge in 2014, one in the Shuja'iyya neighborhood of Gaza City and the other in Rafah, which is that the Israeli forces went into Nuseirat refugee camp. They encountered difficulties. According to Israel, the truck that they were using broke down. According to other reports, they also came under intensive fire from the Palestinians, and the Israelis then resorted to exceptionally intense saturation bombing, indiscriminate saturation bombing of the area around this truck so that they could safely extract their forces. This led to over 270 Palestinian fatalities, the overwhelming majority of them civilian non-combatants, and the wounding of hundreds more. And in today's Gaza Strip, a serious but not life-threatening injury is tantamount to a death sentence, given that Israel has systematically destroyed the health sector, has prevented the entry of medical supplies, and so on. And there's one other aspect that's also important, is that Israel infiltrated Nuseirat refugee camp using a truck. They say it was a furniture truck, but exactly the same kind of truck that has been used throughout the past 8 months, if not longer, to deliver humanitarian assistance. And the purpose of which was to make the Palestinians believe that that truck was delivering supplies. And they then parked it in the center of a very crowded market. And it also appears that many of the casualties were incurred when the Israeli force left the truck or was exiting the truck and shot their way towards the buildings where the Israelis were being held. So what Israel has done, quite ironically, given its constant false propaganda about this issue, is that it has used humanitarian activities as a cover for this raid. It has essentially implicated every humanitarian worker as suspicious by doing so. It appears to have used the so-called humanitarian pier for military purposes. And just as we've seen in the past, Israeli special forces disguising themselves as medics and nurses a few months ago in Jenin refugee camp, disguising themselves as ordinary civilians, disguising themselves as journalists. It goes back to the late 1960s, where at one point Israeli commandos disguised themselves as Red Cross workers in order to storm a plane that Palestinian guerrillas had hijacked. So given all the Israeli accusations about Palestinians hiding behind civilians, not wearing identifiable military outfits, and so on, it's really a little rich. I would like to make one other point about this raid. You know, 4 Israeli captives and hostages were rescued. Nearly 300 Palestinians were killed in one of the most intensive bombings in one of the most intensive bombing campaigns in history. Hundreds more were wounded, many of which, as I mentioned, will die as a result of initially non-life-threatening injuries. And what we've seen in the West is politicians and leaders celebrating this attack with nary a mention of the massive Palestinian death toll. Now, imagine for a moment that 4 British soldiers or 4 British civilians had been taken captive in Derry or Belfast, and British SAS forces went in to rescue them. And in the course of doing so, killed nearly 300 citizens or residents of the surrounding areas and wounded hundreds more. Would that be celebrated as a massive victory? So, let's be clear, it's a significant achievement, or at least an achievement. It can't in any way be compared to, the Entebbe raid of 1976 and in the Ugandan capital. And more importantly, also, regardless of the lengths to which Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has gone to make political capital out of this, at the end of the day, it really doesn't change anything.
Going back to the US's role in this, they've of course come out and denied that the pier, the floating pier in Gaza, was used in the attack. But the question is, what do the people on the ground believe? And if there is further evidence to confirm that that was the case, hasn't the US simply put a target on the back of the pier? And also thinking globally, if a pier, so-called humanitarian pier, can be used for military purposes, does that not also endanger other humanitarian workers, well, in particular US humanitarian workers around the world? Because an enemy group may simply say you're just using this as a ploy to attack our population, and that, in effect, effectively, the US has endangered humanitarian work around the world, hasn't it?
Well, it most certainly does. There does appear to be some visual evidence that the pier did play a role in this operation. And as mentioned before, US and British intelligence services were very, very deeply involved in the planning of this raid. Again, the humanitarian pier was never a humanitarian pier. It was a charade meant to divert attention from the humanitarian emergency and to provide cover for Israel to continue with its barbaric siege of the Gaza Strip, while the press's attention was focused on, how it was being built, when it was being deployed, how quickly it fell apart in rough seas, and so on. But it most certainly poses a danger to each and every humanitarian worker, particularly Western humanitarian workers, not only in the Gaza Strip, but around the globe. I mean, just to go back a few years, you may recall that in the US raid, which killed the Al Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden, we had CIA assets posing as health workers, providing polio vaccines to young children in that neighborhood. And that created all kinds of suspicion and hostility towards genuine medical workers in that area, and had real health effects in terms of parents refusing to have these people enter their homes and vaccinate their children and so on. There's also another factor here. All the agencies that had been cooperating with this peer initiative, they are now, by implication, cast under a cloud of suspicion as well. I'm not saying that's right, and I'm not saying that they had any relationship to this raid, but they're connected to it, whether they like it or not. And the US and Israel and their allies have made absolutely no effort um, to protect these agencies and their reputations and to insulate them from their military activities.
Let's turn our attention to a story from the UN last week. The UN included Israel to its list of states committing violations against children. How ironic would that be, given that one of Israel's propaganda line in manufacturing consent for its genocide on Gaza is that Hamas is ISIS. Hamas is ISIS. And it's been repeating this for many, many years. Now, Israel finds itself on the same UN blacklist as ISIS, as Al-Shabaab, and as other terrorist groups like Boko Haram.
Well, yes, and just to be clear, the United Nations Secretary General, for good measure, presumably to give the appearance of maintaining balance, also added Hamas and Islamic Jihad to that list. There's a history here. In 2015, I believe it was, there was also a recommendation to place Israel on this list. This was during the Obama administration, where Biden was vice president. What happened then is that Samantha Power, the problem from hell, who is now director of USAID, who was then the US permanent representative to the United Nations, pulled out all the stops in terms of lobbying the Secretary General's office to cease and desist and not to place Israel on this list. Subsequently, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was then also Israel's prime minister, called the office of the UN Secretary General and, in typical mafia gangster style, threatened the UN that if it went ahead and placed Israel on this list of shame, that Israel would then use its power within the US Congress to lobby Congress to sever all funding of the United Nations. And it worked. And the following year, Saudi Arabia took a page out of Israel's book and managed to get the recommendation to have Saudi Arabia placed on this list because of its activities in Yemen, also revoked. So what's changed, I think, between 2015 and 2024, you can no longer hide the sun with your finger. Um, the UN would have lost all credibility if, in the face of the tsunami of evidence about its wanton killings of children, its wanton starvation of children in the Gaza Strip, its multiple forms of abuse of the lives and livelihoods of Palestinian children. I mean, to have not included Israel on this list would have made the idea of this list a total sham. It would be the equivalent of leaving the Nazis off of a list of anti-Semites. It just, it would have completely discredited the entire exercise. And so, yes, there was once again massive pressure on the United Nations. I'm sure not only from Israel, but also from Washington, Berlin, and other European capitals to keep Israel off this list. But this time, the pressure not to make itself a laughingstock and the pressure not to thoroughly discredit itself was preponderant, and therefore Israel now finds itself on this list of shame, right next to, as you note, it's in the same company as ISIS, as Al Qaeda, and others with whom it has ceaselessly been comparing its adversaries. But now you have a formal determination that, in fact, Israel belongs in the same company.
Yes, and if killing 15,000 children does not get you on a list of groups and states that are committing crimes against children, then of course that list has no meaning, as you rightly pointed out. And Palestine, more than 15,000 children have been brutally massacred, and that's just a fact. And we see in other cases where gruesome, horrific crimes has been meted out in other ways, not just against children, but also detainees. And that was a focus of a long article by the New York Times last week, giving more details of a piece done by CNN last month. And that's in relation to a detention center within southern Israel, Set Taman, Main. I can't pronounce the word properly. Set Taman, I think that's what it's called, but it's in southern Israel.
I think.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right. Yeah. So the Times investigation uncovered allegations of sexual abuse and torture, like the CNN a month ago. But what was interesting for me is of course not just the shocking details, but the timing itself. Why has the Times come out and done that now? Is it because Israel has already decided to phase out the detention center And is it really another example of the Times having the license to do this, given that there is already criticism within Israel itself of this detention center, and there's a realization that this has become a major source of global condemnation against Israel?
Well, I think your question um, quite rightly reflects the reality that American mainstream journalism has sunk so horribly low that when an article like this is published, we're not just discussing its content, but just as importantly, we're discussing why it was published and under what circumstances it was published. Because, we are talking about the New York Times American Pravda. And so we have to we don't just read the article. We have to analyze the motive behind the publication for this article. I think there are several factors. First of all, there is, the competition between mainstream American news organizations. CNN has published several reports on detainee abuse. The New York Times was increasingly being left behind. Secondly, the CNN report was based primarily on Israeli sources, whistleblowers who had been at these detention facilities. And so when you have Israeli sources, that makes the reporting kosher. Although, of course, Palestinian ex-detainees were interviewed as well. Third of all, it may well be that Israel had an interest in revealing this story because the Israelis repeatedly in this article emphasized how wonderfully they're treating their detainees, that a number of staff had been dismissed for even the suspicion of abuse against their detainees, and so on. And I think also in the broader context of the ICC prosecutors' applications for arrest warrants and so on, it may well be that this article not only serves to reveal the truth, but also serves Israel's own agenda. But as you mentioned, the details in this article are absolutely horrific. Stories of, for example, a Palestinian detainee having a hot poker forcibly inserted into his anus and dying from the wounds. We also learn that being an Israeli soldier and prison guard is actually quite lucrative business because they routinely, as in any other detention facility, confiscate the personal belongings of detainees, but then when they release them, and the detainees ask for their personal belongings back, which in one case mentioned in this article amounted to $2,000 worth of cash, the Palestinian individual was beaten to a pulp for having the temerity to ask for his money back. And, this goes to the extensive evidence we've seen of wanton looting in the Gaza Strip during the past 8 months. And it's quite clear that Israeli soldiers and security personnel have been given not only a license to kill, but also a license to steal. And so, this article doesn't really reveal much we didn't know already. It doesn't reveal much that hasn't been published elsewhere. But the fact that it's now being published in American Pravda is, I think, significant.
Yeah, and what was striking for me as well is how when the so-called paper of record published details of sexual abuse of Palestinian detainees, the US House of Representatives passed a legislation that would sanction the ICC and not say anything about the horrific abuse that was taking place in Israel detention center. And to me, at least, it's almost like there's a higher power working to expose America's degeneration into this moral abyss just to maintain support for the state of Israel. But that said, that's what it seems like to me. That is, of course, predictable American behavior, is it not? And do you think in this instance, the sanctions against the ICC, the Senate will block the measure, or do you think the Senate will approve this and the US will actually sanction the ICC?
Well, two fundamental principles of US foreign policy is that Israel is above the law and Palestinian life is worthless. We saw this very clearly in the recent Israeli raid in the Nuseirat refugee camp and the US response to it. And so the very idea that there are international institutions that have the gall to challenge Israeli impunity and call the Israeli state or its leaders to account is the most violent offense against the natural order of things that a US politician can encounter, that the US government can encounter. And this explains their frenzied, hysterical response. Well, if the ICC wants to treat Israeli leaders according to the same standards that it treats, for example, Russian leaders or African leaders, then the problem is not the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by these Israeli leaders. No, the problem is with the institution, and the institution needs to be sanctioned and destroyed and consigned to the dustbin of history. Regarding your specific question, will the Senate go along with this initiative? I suspect it will, probably encouraged by the White House and State Department, but we'll have to see.
Yes, you mentioned earlier that one of the thinking behind the brutal attack on the Nuseirat refugee camp on Saturday is because Netanyahu wants to fight back against the defeatist mentality and present and portray some kind of a victory narrative. If you try to do that, I think the resignation of Benny Gantz kind of undermines that whole aim of trying to project a victory narrative. So Gantz resigned again over the weekend. And is this another indication of how badly the war is going for Israel? Gantz himself, and I quote, said, "Unfortunately, Mr. Netanyahu is preventing us from approaching true victory," whatever that means, which is the justification for the painful ongoing crisis. So Gantz doesn't seem to be agreeing with Netanyahu. I don't know what victory looks like in the minds of Gantz, but clearly, whatever intention Netanyahu had in targeting and killing nearly 3,000 Palestinians is not going to change the narrative that Israel is losing the battle for narratives.
Yes, I think in terms of the resignation of Benny Gantz and his sidekick, Gadi Eisenkot, who have been hailed as the great white hopes of Israeli politics and moderate figures who passionately believe in peace and all the rest of it. I mean, look at the record of these people. Gadi Eisenkot, to give just one example, is the author of the so-called Dahya doctrine, which defines massive, indiscriminate, disproportionate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure as an explicit war aim and promotes it as a strategy. The term is taken from Israel's attack on the Dahya al-Janubiyya, the southern suburbs of Beirut, in 2006. Well, what we've seen in Gaza over the past 8 months is the Dahya doctrine on steroids. So quite clearly, pulverizing the Gaza Strip, reducing it to rubble, and committing genocide against its Palestinian inhabitants is not the reason that these people are leaving the Israeli war cabinet, which they've been part and parcel of for 8 months. I think there are several things going on. On the one hand, if you look at it in narrow Israeli party political context, I think they no longer wanted to serve as a fig leaf for the agenda, policies, and continued political survival of their main political rivals, namely Netanyahu and his sidekicks, Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Secondly, they were hoping that by presenting themselves as the ones who were urging the Israeli government to accept a deal that would lead to the release of Israeli captives and hostages in the context of a ceasefire, that they would curry favor not only with those sections of the Israeli public that are calling for Israel to accept such a deal, but also with the West, and particularly the US government, in the hope that the US government would basically adopt them as its Israeli leaders of choice. But we've discussed this before. Netanyahu is a much better demagogue than these two characters. My suspicion is he'll make mincemeat out of them. And to the extent that they do try to present themselves as a moderate alternative, they will be rejected by an increasingly hysterical and irrational Israeli electorate. It will have one effect. They can they've been there for 8 months. They are deeply implicated in every decision that Israel has taken since October. They are both military men by background, and I think their resignation, to some extent, also reflects their conclusion that this is a war that cannot be won. It reflects, I think, growing divisions within the Israeli security establishment between those who want to continue in the hope that some achievement will be realized so that it will be easier for them when they have to take responsibility, and those who feel that doing more of the same is not going to lead to a different outcome, and Israel needs to change its strategy. Both Eisenkot and Gantz in the recent past were, in fact, advocates of changing the focus of the Israeli military from Gaza to Lebanon. And now that they're gone, they can no longer serve as a fig leaf for the Israeli government. Every country that continues to be aligned with Israel can now no longer pretend that they are seeking to promote an alternative to Netanyahu and to Ben Gvir and to Smotrich. They now can no longer pretend that they are not in cohabitation with the most extreme right-wing spectrum of Israeli politics. Biden, Schultz, Sunak, Starmer next month, and all the rest of them are now aligned with Israel's fascist right and supporting it. They have been all
And
along, but it's
yeah,
just been clarified much greater.
and talking about the rise of Israel's fascist right, I think we got further confirmation of that from last week during the what the Israelis call the flag march, but it's very much a hate march. It's not really a flag march, and we saw young Israelis chanting, well, um, roaming with the familiar genocidal chants against Arabs and wanted to lynch Palestinians. We saw one Palestinian journalist actually being almost lynched. He was hounded by a group of young Israeli settlers. Um, what do you think of the fact that majority of those taking part in this hate march are actually young Israelis? If you look around the world, by and large, the younger generation tend to be more progressive, more hopeful, and more left wing. Whereas when you look at Israel, the younger generation who will become the next Netanyahu and the next Smotrich and Ben Gvir, they are extremely resentful. They are on the far right. And that's why I asked, is the flag march really Zionism in its purest form?
I would say so. It's the high point of the Israeli political calendar. Every year, these tens of thousands of Israeli youths march through the old city of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, the Palestinian old city of Jerusalem, and then other neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, shouting their favorite slogan, "Death to the Arabs, death to the Arabs." And they have a new slogan, which is almost as dear to them: "May your village burn." They celebrate the literal burning alive of Palestinian infant in the northern West Bank a few years ago. Um, there's videos of weddings where the bride and groom and their families are, in complete hysteria, celebrating the burning alive of Palestinian infants. Imagine what this society has come to. And when these marches are undertaken, in which physical assaults on Palestinians, on Palestinian property, are integral to these celebrations, they of course do so not only under the watchful eye of the Israeli police and military. These marches could not take place without the protection of the Israeli police and military. I mean, you look at this march, and this is what Israeli society has become. You talk to Israeli analysts, and they will confirm, this is a direction that Israeli society has adopted. Having said that, I think it would be a little unfair to place the blame exclusively on Israel's political elite for the direction in which their society has been going. This would be impossible without the decades of passive acquiescence, of active support, of coddling, of ensuring impunity that has been given to them by their chief sponsors, the United States and the European Union. Washington and Brussels have sent a very clear message to Israeli politicians and to Israeli youth. Your impunity is sacred to us. We consider Palestinian life as worthless as you do, and we will ensure that you can do whatever you want, and we will defend you to our last dying breath. That's what's going on.
There's another story that grabbed my attention last week, and I want to get your thoughts on that. It's related to Saudi Arabia. There was a story in the Times of Israel, which reported that Saudi Arabia has changed its curriculum and removed negative portrayal of Israel from its school curriculum starting from last year, 2023, 2024. Give us your thoughts on that. Juxtaposing Saudi attempts to cultivate a more sympathetic pro-Israeli population, which this seems to be clearly an attempt to do, with the fact that globally, including here in the West, every demographic cohort is turning against Israel. And that is, for me, a proof that it's got nothing to do with the syllabus. It's just the images you see on your TV and what Israel is doing. A new poll, for example, in the UK by a group called, outlet called Unheard, found that most young British people think that Israel should not exist. Now, it's a shocking poll for the Israelis, but that's the trajectory of where the new generation is heading. And now the UK does not have an anti-Israel textbook, but most young Brits think Israel should not exist. So what is Saudi trying to do here in changing its curriculum, trying to cultivate this more pro-Israeli population?
Well, maybe the European Union should now do serial investigations of the UK curriculum, similar to what it does with the Palestinian curriculum. I'm sure it will find something which will lead to another several dozen investigations and perhaps a recommendation or two. But that aside, the Saudi curriculum has been under intensive Western scrutiny, in fact, since 2001 and the 11 September attacks in New York and Washington. And there have been significant changes. Now, I don't want to take any Israeli reporting about Saudi Arabia at face value. But having said that, and assuming for the sake of argument that these reports are accurate, it can be seen in the broader context of the Saudi leadership trying to curry favor with its patrons in Washington, and also as a part of a larger campaign to prepare Saudi public opinion, which is passionately pro-Palestinian, as you know, to prepare it for the prospect of peace with Israel, of coexistence with an Israeli state. Now, what I presume is a substantially pro-Israeli curriculum in the United Kingdom hasn't exactly worked. So I have my doubts about how effective any changes in the Saudi curriculum are going to be in changing Saudi attitudes about Israel and Palestine. I suspect that most youth will will develop their views about Palestine in response to conversations with their parents, their neighbors, their relatives, what they see on television or on their mobile devices and so on. And unless you get the Anti-Defamation League to start appointing Anti-Defamation League or Defamation League staff or the World Zionist Organization in charge of the faculty of Saudi schools, I don't think much is going to change.
Yeah, I doubt very much. But let's end with two stories that's related to the US and again reveals how the US is playing the role as the most effective underwriter of war crimes and crimes against humanity any patron state could ever hope for. The first is a story about Washington urging Arab allies not to set deadlines for post-war two-state solution. What can you tell us about that? Then we'll get to the final story of our show today.
Well, this is part of a broader dialogue between Washington and its Arab client regimes about post-war planning. Just getting back to an earlier part of our conversation, one of Gantz's disputes with Netanyahu is that he claims correctly that Netanyahu doesn't have a plan for the day after the war. In other words, that the existing reality is his plan, whereas Gantz has a plan that would place the Gaza Strip under American, European, Arab, Palestinian, Israeli, something or other international administration, and he actually thinks this is a realistic plan, and he actually thinks he can sell it to all those concerned, and he's quite upset that Netanyahu hasn't accepted that. Well, we have something similar here. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as mendacious as always, has been, he and his boss Biden have been saying two-state solution ad nauseum. And when the Arab governments called them on this and said, okay, we need to see a viable plan to actually get there, Blinken said, well, wait a minute, that's not what we meant. What we meant is that we will resume negotiations, about a framework to establish a agenda to study the possibility of, or whatever. And it's basically, the US, as it has done since the 1990s, using the prospect of a resolution of this conflict as a diversion from reality on the ground. And if anyone genuinely believed that the US had any interest in ending the Israeli occupation, or was going to take any measures to ever challenge the indefinite continuation of Israel's occupation, one need only look at this story.
And also, I think this story related to what you just said, an amendment of a draft ceasefire resolution at the United Nations Security Council, where the US is seeking changes to the wording about what Israel can occupy and cannot occupy in Gaza. Can you tell us more about that change that have been inserted into the draft by the US?
Yes, well, this continues a discussion we've had before, which is that the US has presented what it states is an Israeli ceasefire proposal. The only problem is Israel has yet to make a public statement either that this is its proposal or that it's committed to its implementation. And so, as ever, Washington's response to Israeli prevarication is to say it's all Hamas's fault. And the only obstacle to implementing this ceasefire proposal is Hamas's refusal to accept it. And Hamas's position, of course, is we don't care what Biden says. We want to hear a clear statement from the Israeli government that it accepts this initiative and that it is committed to its implementation, which of course they're not going to get. And you're certainly not going to get Israeli pressure on US pressure on Israel to accept its own proposal. What's happening now is the US presented a draft resolution to the United Nations Security Council, which again called on Hamas to or demanded that Hamas accept the ceasefire proposal without even suggesting that Israel should do the same. But there were other elements of that resolution that Israel found objectionable, such as its rejection, the draft resolution's rejection of the establishment of a Israeli buffer zone inside the Gaza Strip and some other elements. So now there's a revised draft resolution which addresses some of the Arab and international concerns about the initial draft, but also responds to Israel's objections. So now it only opposes a permanent change to the territorial realities in the Gaza Strip. In other words, Israel can have an indefinite buffer zone. It just can't have a permanent buffer zone. My suspicion is that this resolution is, Washington is so out of step with the planet. It's really living in a fantasy world of its own, created for it by Israel. It has lost all connection with reality. Blinken has become mendacity personified. And I'd be very surprised if this draft resolution makes it past the Security Council.
That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, talking to us about the key events from over the past week. Thank you, Mouin.
Thank you very much, Nasim, as always.
And thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of Memo Review with me, Nasim Ahmed. Bye-bye.